Minister on the defensive again today, upholding the merits of his marquee climate change policy, the federal carbon tax. Justin Trudeau has held a pretty consistent message that Canada needs a price on pollution since its introduction back in 2016. Well, that was until about 2 weeks ago when he announced a pretty big exemption that primarily benefits Atlantic Canada. Since then, on the defensive, facing calls from the Conservatives and the New Democrats and premiers across the country to offer up national carbon tax relief for all Canadians. Trudeau saying we have to face difficult choices in the here and now to ensure a brighter future for the environment. Let's bring in our front bench. In Calgary, Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate back in the 2021 election. Nowadays, she's a principal at Shakti Strategies. Larissa Waller from GT and Company previously served as a head of communications for Ontario's Premier Doug Ford. Former Ontario NDP MPP Guradan Singh, now Vice President at Crestview Strategy. He's also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and our very own senior digital parliamentary reporter here at CTV News, Rachel Aiello, who is in the capital. And Guradan, I'm going to start with you this week. This debate isn't going anywhere. What's going on, do you think? It just keeps on dogging the Prime Minister.
Well, let's start by recognizing that the climate crisis is a very important crisis. It's the greatest threat facing humanity, and we need real solutions to address it. The problem with how the Liberal government has managed this issue, I think that's really at the crux of it, and it really stems from this carve-out that was created in Atlantic Canada, which was largely criticized to be motivated for partisan reasons. This is a lot of folks point out the fact that these are vulnerable seats, and this is something that would be politically advantageous to have this carve out for Atlantic Canada, which ultimately the rest of Canada recognizes that our whole nation is cold, and every Canadian deserves a break with respect to their heating. So I think largely this issue has to do with the Liberals and how poorly they manage this issue. And it's really unfortunate because it's actually hurting an issue that is truly important for our collective survival, something that fights the climate crisis. So it's just another example of Liberal mismanagement, and it's sad to see, though, that it impacts something which is so crucial for all Canadians.
To you, Larissa Waller, how much damage do you think this is doing to Justin Trudeau with voters?
I think a lot of damage. I think he sort of took the lid off the box with the carve out because he's opened himself up to conversations around his own climate policies. You know, in the clip you played about the Prime Minister, what he says is true, that future generations will be paying the cost of inaction. Where he misses the point, though, is that this is not just a Canadian problem. And so his whole policy on climate change and on energy is to introduce a cost of living tax. And I know that sounds a little partisan, but really carbon pricing, that's what it is. It's designed to make behaviors so expensive that you change your behavior. And he's saying Canadians should do this to help solve the climate crisis. Even if that worked, which it does not, our climate targets have been missed with his carbon tax. Even if Canada was successful with that policy, Canada plays such a small fraction of global climate crisis. So he's asking Canadians to take on an extreme burden that will have no actual impact in the global climate crisis. What Canada should be doing is encouraging alternate energy sources in developing countries like India and China, because until those developing countries change their energy mix, the climate crisis won't be solved. And so the idea that he's asking Canadians to pay even more and more and more for something that will not actually change the outcome of our climate crisis globally is, I think, like just really not a good thing to do and really politically a bad idea.
So, Sabrina, to you, the argument here seems to be short-term pain for long-term gain. Does that work anymore? Are you worried as a Liberal that that argument is not resonating the way it once did, perhaps, when the Prime Minister was first elected?
I think the last 3 elections we've seen have been fought on this climate issue, and with each passing year, the impacts of climate are intensifying on people's lives and on their homes, and that cost is intensifying to them on a personal level. So maybe 10 years ago, you couldn't personally see the cost of climate on your life, but when your house is up in flames, when your backyard is up in flames, when your house is underwater, when your community is underwater, you are seeing those costs personally be attributed to your life, and those are costs directly related to climate. And I agree with Larissa. We have to come to the table and ask, other countries to be equally as ambitious on their own climate goals, but we come to the table with a climate plan and a climate plan that's credible. The only target that we have is 2030. 2023 is not a target. 2024 is not a target. So yeah, it's fair to say that that the track might be off right now, but it's unfair to say that we haven't met any targets. The target hasn't even happened yet. And so I think that what the Liberals really need to do is upcoming on this November 21st fall economic statement that we are going to hear from Minister Freeland is redefine the narrative about why climate is economics, why the finance ambitions and why ambitions about our spending, about our growth, about our economic future is tied to climate, and be able to really illustrate that this is not a choice that we can make on an individual basis, that this is going to be a choice for economics for our country.
You wonder, Rachel, whether there are conversations going on behind the scenes with Liberal strategists, whether the government needs to dial back the emphasis on the environment, at least temporarily, while we're dealing with a cost of living crisis. What's your read from Ottawa?
Well, two things I'm going to be kind of watching for here, Todd, is yes, this conversation in the upcoming fall economic statement is supposed to be about affordability in housing. So I'm not sure how much of the environment conversation is going to play in there. But then this relief on home heating oil has actually come into effect now. The Prime Minister promised it would be 14 days after he announced it. We've now hit that mark. So what I'm wondering is if those Liberal strategists, Todd, are not heading out to Atlantic Canada desperately trying to find the very happy home heating oil users who have now gotten a break on their price on pollution. Because I think, like we've seen in past budgets, they'd probably do well by finding some of these examples of, so-and-so's gotten a break. This is how much he saved. This is why we did what we did. Some sort of good news story out of this is probably what they're after. But I think the overall conversation about whether or not we should pivot off of a focus on the environment might be short-sighted, maybe politically advantageous right now. But I think the conversation the Conservatives are pushing about, encouraging other countries to do better, it's kind of a bit odd. Conservatives saying on other files like foreign interference, the Liberals have no influence on the world stage, but somehow they could convince China to change their habits. I'm not sure if that's the strongest argument to be making.
Back to you, Garatin. Do you think we're going to see a course correction on the environment or not from the government?
Well, I hope what we actually do see is a course correction with respect to how they're communicating with respect to the government, with respect to the climate, because I think that's the core of the issue here. It's important that we fight the climate crisis. It's important that we bring in initiatives to fight the climate crisis. And I really think that this is just an issue of the Liberals being unable to communicate a very important issue and frankly, using a very important issue for political gain. And that's really problematic because when you start to, use important issues in these kind of fashions, you start to erode trust in the public with respect to the government's actual policies. So we really need to approach climate in an unbiased way, in a scientific way. We need to make sure we're putting forth policy that actually will address the climate crisis. And we can't then at the same time, the Liberals can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't espouse at one time to say they're fighting the climate crisis and then bring forth partisan motivated carve-outs for electoral benefit.
Back to you, Larissa, and the question, does it seem out of touch with the day-to-day concerns of many Canadians who are feeling the squeeze financially, to talk about things like a carbon tax, and then the Conservatives pounce on the word tax, and people think, I don't want to pay any more taxes.
Yeah, so if you look at, when do people volunteer more? When do they donate more? They do that when they can afford to, when they have the time or the money, right? Like the donations to the Salvation Army go down when people can't afford to give money to the Salvation Army. I think that with climate change, people, especially in Canada, are willing to play their part, but only if they can afford to. And it's too expensive right now to expect them to be able to pay, $8 for a pound of butter, $1.60 for a liter of gas, $600 for home heating oil, or your heating bill in the winter. So I think that the Liberals need to come up with a real solution for the cost of living crisis if they expect Canadians to put climate action back on their priority list.
To you, Sabrina, your take on what the strategy needs to be now in the months ahead. How do you stay true to your values about the environment if you're the government, but also hear these concerns, that Larissa and others are expressing out there, no doubt sort of reiterating what a lot of Canadians are thinking right now?
So I think they do have a lot of options on providing affordability and relief on the affordability side, whether that is, talking about the climate incentive action payments, potentially increasing that rebate, whether they talk about GST on home heating. So they do have a couple of options in terms of temporarily lifting some of the affordability crisis that we are seeing in the short term. But in the long term, I think that the Liberals need to stick really hard to their climate plan. With the way that the NDP voted in the House this week, I think it's going to be easy to be able to push the NDP onto not being serious about climate. In 2021, they had an unserious plan about climate that was, recorded by economists. So I think that if the Liberals want to win on the climate and they want to continue to provide it as the issue that they're going to run on, then they have to continue to be serious about it. They have to be ambitious about it and think about other affordability measures in the interim.
Rachel, your read on how much of a factor the environment might be in the next federal election, and I appreciate it's a long way off, but it was pretty core the last couple of elections for the Trudeau government's platforms.
Well, I think we got a bit of a taste of that in question period this week. Like, the partisanship was on all sides. I take the NDP's thought that this is a bad thing for the Liberals to be politicizing, but let's be real, all parties did that this week. There was opposition motions from both the Conservatives and the NDP. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh coming out calling the Prime Minister a climate delayer and Conservative leader Poilievre a climate denier. So we're already hearing that wording. I think all parties are kind of shaping up their language around this. We've heard for months Poilievre's position. We heard this week the NDP's. And then we got the Prime Minister saying essentially the NDP have let down progressives by siding with the Conservatives on that motion, and that they still think that the Conservatives don't have a credible plan of their own. So it will definitely be a conversation. I think a lot of focus will come on what the Conservatives propose, because that has been a sticking point in the last two races where the environment was a topic of conversation, where the Liberals really able to point to their Conservative plans as not up to snuff.
Yeah, Garat, and what about those accusations that the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh flip-flopping on the environment and then flip-flopping again on the environment? Very supportive of climate action and then siding with the Conservatives on that motion, and then now wanting to put forward a motion about removing the GST. Give me your sense.
Well, let's start by saying that the Conservatives have no climate policy. It's clear that they have no direction and no intention to put forth policy to actually fight the climate crisis. The Liberals, on the other hand, have politicized something which is very, very important for all Canadians in the world to address. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have been very clear from the beginning that they'll support policies that help Canadians across the board. That's something that they've been very principled on. And this, with respect to the GST issue, this is a long-standing NDP policy. This has been something that I think since 2008, Jack Layton has put forward this policy. The NDP has always been committed towards the fighting the climate crisis, and in face of a Liberal government which is making it partisan and a Conservative opposition which frankly has no plan, I think the NDP has been clear that it's principally connected and supportive of fighting the climate crisis, and at the same time making sure that we're doing the best policies to help Canadians get through a really tough economic time.
Last word to you, Larissa, on this. Your read on what the NDP have done and are doing on this file.
I think it's fair for the NDP to agree that these regional carve-outs are unfair to the rest of the country. And the Liberals open the door to that. You see premiers across the country targeting their local MPs to ask them for relief for their constituents. The one thing I do want to bring up that everybody sort of has talked about, everybody treats the carbon tax like it's the only tool to fight climate change. That's just not true. There are many ways to fight climate change. The carbon tax is one tool. So just because you don't agree with the carbon tax does not make you a climate change denier. It does not make you believe that there doesn't need to be action. It's just changing how you think those targets can be met.